Hi, this is Pinkney and welcome to my tutorial. This is the second part on from creating this to this, and I'm going to show you all the materials that I've used. And I used Crayola pencils. My paper is a Bristol from Canson. I also use a Strathmore, and I believe the paper that I used today was Strathmore. There we go, Canson. And I just cut it up. I treated it with some store baby oil. Let that sit about overnight underneath the fan, or just pretty much let it sit overnight. And then, I also coated it with this. This is the baby oil, and I applied it with one of these. And these are the pencils that I used. If you're going to try this technique, prepare your paper a day in advance, and then test your pencils out on a strip of the paper. So I cut out a strip, and this is what they look like. And I didn't blend anybody on this. I just wanted to show you what it would look like on here. And here is Salmon. And it came out like that, and they're pretty vibrant. And on this paper, they just go really smooth. It's just awesome. This is blue. These are the colors that I used to make this fella. And I'll just put him right under here. Colors to the side here. And I'll try to point out where I use the colors if you can't tell. And it's kind of cool that you can't, it may be hard to tell simply because I've blended it with a blending stub. So I used, again, Salmon on his lips. I have a light brown that I used very sparingly. He doesn't have, with the way the light was hitting his face, he wasn't really, he was really harshly highlighted. So you'll see a lot of the light on the sides of his face, and it gives him this chiseled look. And it was really dark right here. I used no black, particularly because I ran out and I couldn't find any. So I ended up having to improvise, and you'll be doing that when it comes. That's why I have so many colors here. I used a light brown, and pretty much I used it about right here, and it was blended in, and it gave the, I used Orchid to get a little bit more of this purplish tone to his skin. I used brown, the regular brown, and I just pretty much blended it in with some of these areas. You'll see it in the video as I go. This is Orchid. I used that a couple places. I used a little bit of the sand, and that gave me some of the highlight in some of these areas. I had used the brown to outline. This is blue. This is gray. I used that about right here at his cheeks. It was hitting it so hard, the light was hitting it so hard that rather it looking brown, it looked like a bluish gray. That's why it looks so strange right here. I definitely used white. And I started out with white. I used Mahogany, and that gives this really beautiful reddish tone to the skin. I used a violet purple, and I used that along with the dark brown to get my black tones. And dark brown was used pretty much throughout this entire picture. I hit it the hardest dark browns in the deepest, darkest shadows that he has, and then I blended it in. This here is Mauve, and I'll be using that a little bit in the lighter parts. This is Taupe, and I used that probably around here. Taupe and Tan. Let's see, and I use that pretty much in these little areas right here where it goes from the darkest brown to the maroon and raspberry. I used raspberry a lot to get this tone here. Yeah, and that's everybody. And I'll list them in the description below. And those are the colors that I used. Again, here they are, and this is what they look like. And when you layer them on top of each other, you'll get this effect. And I'll show you how I did it.
Alright, so first of all, I wanted to transfer my image, and when you use the baby oil, it tones your paper to this duller color, and it also makes the paper slick. It changes the texture of the paper. And so what I'm using right here is brown, and I'm going around lightly, very lightly. That way I can go over it with any other color and it won't interrupt anything. And you can see that it becomes transparent. So that's one of the wonderful things about using baby oil all over the paper. Now if you only used it in certain spots, it would leave like little splotches, and it's kind of ugly and hard to cover up. So just go ahead and coat the entire thing and let it sit overnight. And I'm pretty much just tracing very, very lightly the outlines that I had created. Now in the future, if I don't have that color being used in those areas like around the eye, around the ears, things like that, I'm going to use the color that is closest to what actually is there. So if it is a white highlight, I'm going to use a white highlight. Only because it was difficult and off-putting every time I noticed that the brown stuck out and it didn't make sense to the source image. So I'm pretty much only hitting the places to give me an idea of where things are. I don't want to go all out on this, because what I'm going to do is begin mapping the face, all the highlights. You want to lay down your highlights once you're done transferring your image, or if you don't mind, you could keep the bottom image underneath. It may get a little splotchy from depending on how wet the paper still is from the night before's treatment. You can start using it as soon as an hour in, depending on how slick you really want your pencils to glide. If it's still very wet, it'll really glide, it'll really blend, but it still has a wet look. But anyway, moving forward, as we outline this, I'm really trying to hit the darker parts of the face where I know that will be covered up by another color. Unfortunately, on the sides of his face, they're hit with so many highlights, excuse me, that it becomes, I have to go over it with the white, which was no problem. On this, I didn't hit it so hard that I couldn't blend out the brown outlines. So I'm almost done outlining it. And just do it lightly. Your pencil, it might be best to have it nice and sharp. That way, but not too sharp to where it'll snap off. It's kind of annoying when you have little bits and flecks of pieces of your pencil embedded into the paper. This paper will have a completely different texture than what you're used to, and these colors will blend themselves into the weirdest spots, places where you just cannot rub them out. And you cannot erase. Not until this thing is completely dry, and even then it may smudge. So just do your best to try to keep it clean. Just in the interest of maintaining the picture beneath, sometimes I would use a sheet protector, and I would put that over the image. That way the baby oil wouldn't ruin the paper. With this one, I don't intend to use this image again, so I really didn't care so much if it ruined the paper on the bottom. I also removed the paper after a while. That way I don't have to worry about shifting or whatnot like that, and that's why I put the lines in. But if you really don't want any outlines at all, I would leave the picture underneath and work from that. The ears barely had any detail to them. They were very, very simple. Probably the easiest ears I've ever drawn. And they're kind of pointed. And it's accentuated even further because of the shape of his head and his haircut. So I'm just throwing in any more cues that I may possibly need. And I'm constantly looking back at my source image as well as I'm doing my outlines, just in case I might have missed something. Now, from doing your line art, you'll get a good idea of what your source image really looks like. You'll be looking at it for a while. I know I've looked at this one for about 4 hours straight. Okay, now I started mapping out just a few places with the darker pencil, just so I could see them a lot better. Be very careful if you're starting with the dark first and you have a lighter toned person. When you start to shade and color with other colors, it comes out kind of strange. Okay, one of the first things that I do is I use white to highlight my highlights. I isolate them, and that way I don't accidentally lose them by coloring over them too soon or blending them out and just losing them. So go ahead and hit everything that looks white or is really light, like say you're going to use a lighter tone or a mixture of tones and it's light but not quite white. Go ahead and hit that gently. And anything that really gets the light, that hits it super hard, like his temples, the little dot on his nose, around that dot, I would with the side of my pencil, lightly block that in. Just give it a nice little shade, little white shade in there. I hit the eyeballs, and I know that I'm going to color those in gray. But just so that I have a reference, I throw the white in there. There's little white highlights around his eyes. It's really super strong around the sides of his face, including his temples, on his ears, and I'll be adding those as well. Now, when you start to use this, you'll see that you'll need a couple passes with the pencil, but you don't have to press hard to get it. Now, if you do want to really lay in that color, press a little hard, give it a little bit more pressure. But with the paper being the way it is nice and slick, it's almost as like using a Prismacolor, where they're really soft. And these pencils just glide across this thing. And they blend. So don't let anybody tell you that these colors don't blend. When you do details on using these colored pencils, these Crayola colored pencils, make sure that your image is larger than the tip of your pencil. Your smallest details, make sure that the tip of your pencil isn't, larger than that particular thing that you're aiming for. Because if it gets muddy, this makes the pencils really soft. It really just brings the wax right on out of the pencils, and it's really hard to make super fine details with this kind of paper. So try to draw large is basically what I'm trying to say. Okay, there's some of the highlights around his eyelids. Hit the little whites in his eye. Now I may do another coloring tutorial, but with a female, because all the male pictures that I found, the lighting is much different. It's like with the females, it was more softer, more even toned, but with this one, the light, or they were either black and white, and I didn't want to do another black and white picture. I'm trying to get away from black and white. I've been drawing black and white ever since I started drawing, and it's about time I had some color in my life. So, but with the gentlemen, all of them, they seem to have really harsher lights. Like it was to bring out their chiseled cheekbones, or just give them an overall impression of what the face looks like. Now I'm just laying down the white. I'm laying down the white along the face. And his jowls, they come inwards. And it really brings out the muzzle of his mouth and his cheekbones. Now everywhere I noticed after staring at his face for 4 hours, I've noticed that everywhere I put the highlight, there is a corresponding darkness that goes along with it. It's almost the blending between the two is extremely subtle, and the light is so severe on his face that only like the center portion of his face will have the color. The rest will be in the harsh highlight and or the darkness, or the dark tones rather. There's the highlights around the lips. If you don't have a source image, just try to remember where your light is hitting the face. Remember that the face is round and that different parts of the face stick out and jut out and recede. So just remember you're highlighting a ball or coloring a ball, how you have where the light is hitting it the hardest, it's white, and as you go further away from the light, it becomes dark. So I'm just laying it down in the neck where it's really light. And it's really light on that side of the neck. This side of the neck is not as light. So the lighting was just a slightly uneven. Now if you miss any spots, that's okay. You can always come back and add them. You can add them as you draw, and the white does lay on top of other colors, not as well as a Prismacolor or one of the higher end white pencils, but it does what it needs to do. Now these sides of his jowls are going to be like a grayish tone, but I went ahead and mapped it out anyway, so I'd have a good idea of where they're going to fall, so that way I don't lose them. Because it's easier to go from light to dark than dark to light. Now you'll also notice that when it comes to drawing, or rather coloring people of color, the darker the person is, the more different it is from drawing lighter skin toned people. Lighter skin toned people, you'll notice that when you color them, the movement of colors, the movement of tones, the browns and the shadows, all that tones the face. It's like the color is all in the shadows. You'll bring all your contouring and whatnot, all of that is in the shadows. However, when you do a dark skinned person, all your coloring and you do your contouring in the dark with the dark colors, but you'll do all your highlights with the movement of tone. It's really a weird concept to grasp, but you'll start to catch it as I'm drawing. Um, you can't or you shouldn't draw the darker toned people like you would a light toned person, because the way the colors fall are completely different. With this guy here, his movement of color, the purples, the browns, uh, are all happening in the highlighted area, and you'll see that as I go. Um, and all his other shadows, they're pretty dark, and there's very, very, very little movement of tone in that. So, with dark-skinned people, you can probably get away with using your dark color as your shadows. Throw your shadows on in there, and then in your highlighted area, that's where you'll have your movement of color. You'll start to see that on his chin, the ball of his nose, and on his forehead. Now, I apologize for having the paper so high up. I'm using a GoPro camera, and I can't see where the image is until after I take a break, upload, and let the camera recharge. That's when I finally start to do that, that's where I can see where my camera is actually sitting. It's like a fisheye lens as well. So I do bring it down. I promise, I promise, I promise. Okay, and now here's where I start to lay in dark tones. This is my first layer. This is the dark brown. And just keep in mind, I'm not using any black. If I need to get darker than the dark brown, if I need to get as close to black as I need to, I will look at the color chart, and I would use the opposite color on the color chart. So in this case I used blue to bring out the darker tone of the brown. And you'll see that more on the temple and around his chiseled jaw here, or rather cheekbones. Where I'm hitting all these areas is where it's the darkest. I'm adding it lightly in some places and harder in others. I really want to blend out inwards to get my tones moving. Now I'm being kind of wimpy laying down some of the colors, only because I want to be certain that they're actually going to go there. So I'm doing it very lightly. And just trying to get those colors together. Now where I did add darkness, there is always a corresponding highlight. So I found that on his jaw and in other places. And that only accentuates, they both accentuate each other. And I just keep going back and forth towards my source image to see where all the other shadows are. Around his nose was a lot of heavy dark shadows. So I could have basically outlined with the dark brown pencil. At least in this area. Now, before I go any further, I added a protector between my hand and the rest of the paper, because if as you start to move your hand across the paper, it will smear. It will spread the colors around, especially if you start out heavy and dark. Even the more that you put on there, the more it's going to smear and blend. Most of the time in places you don't want it to happen. Now, if you can work in one spot, cool, if you can, but my hand starts to cramp up, especially after hour 3. So what I did is I would go to different other areas. It's kind of a pain in the, to keep switching pencils. So I try to hit the pencil where I think all the colors are going to be. Now around his lips, it was dark, but also right above it, there's a highlight of white. So everywhere I had darkness, there was some sort of light that was corresponding with it. And just keep referring back to your source image. Where is the shadows in your source image? Depending on how dark your source image person is, sometimes I lay down an undercolor, but with this particular image, I really didn't have a really good color to pick out. So this is why I started out with the highlights first, and then I started throwing in the shadows, and then I started blending from the shadow to the highlight. At this stage, it looks very strange, especially when you start to add your skin tones, and you'll be wanting to throw it away because it'll look really ugly, but don't give up. Just keep going. This is not one of those things where you could just add color like in a coloring book and be done with it. This is these are working in layers, and it takes a little bit of a time. But it's worth it. The end result is totally worth it. So at this point I'm adding even more shadows as my source image dictates. It's very dark under his chin, under his neck, on his neck, and I start to add the raspberry and other colors a little bit later. Now along his neck, it's kind of like it goes to a hard white to a gray to the black. So there is a little bit of movement of tone there, and I'll be blending that out with the blending stub as well. Before you start using your stub, go ahead and just lay down your colors. Lay down at least 2 or 3 colors if you can before you start to blend it out, because you need to give yourself something to work with. Have enough on there to move the tones, or else you'll be constantly rubbing it off and then having to put it back on, rubbing it off, putting it back on. Okay, so we're going to bust into time lapse here. It's a little bit of the same. I'm adding the dark tones where it's got that hint of darkness there. There's a lot of dark around his nose. Using the mauve, and around his nose you'll see that the ball becomes a lot more pronounced. Now, alternating between raspberry and brown, and the dark brown, I start to blend it in, and it becomes like a darkish, brownish purple. You'll notice that with people of color, you'll see a lot of different tones, like this mahogany color, a little bit of the light brown. We're not just one tone, particularly in the highlights. You see that I've blended in the raspberry along with the dark brown, and then I go back over with the dark brown because I want to get it a little bit more richer. Now the highlights even have a slight bit of a tone to them, a little bit of the raspberry tone to them, a little bit of the maroon. His face is more of a cooler tone. That's one of the other things that you'll need to determine once you start to draw your dark-skinned person. Is it a warmer kind of color, or is it a darker, cooler kind of tone? And so if it's cooler, then you want to use more of the cooler cooler pencils. Up above I used mulberry, sorry, I want to call it mulberry. I used the mahogany. Mahogany brings out that reddish tone. I used the blue to make my eyebrows a little darker than the darker tone up above on the forehead. And you see where the tones are in these highlights. If it was a lighter skinned person, the highlights would be a lighter brown. You would see less of the white and more of like maybe the peachish skin tone, orangish peachish skin tone. So as I start to map out the colors, I go ahead and start laying it down a little bit darker, blending it, and then adding more. If I have enough on my blending stub, I'll use it in other places as well. Sometimes I'll use some of the excess that's on the stub into some of the highlighted areas that need a little bit of tone to them. I added a little bit of blue to the pupil of the eye, so I can make sure that that's nice and black, and just used a basic brown, the dark brown in the eyes. And just try to pay attention to what the colors are looking like all around the image. Is this as dark as that? Ask yourself, is this tone a little bit darker than the tone up above, or is it the same tone? And just try to work them. You don't want one tone to be darker than the other when it's not supposed to be. There was a lot of movement of color underneath his eyebrow. So you'll see me with a lot of the mahogany, and you'll start to see orchid and a little bit of the tan. A lot of movement of color on the cheeks there. And just keep adding it and adding it. And you want to try to get as close to the tones as possible, as the colors will allow you to. Now, if your paper starts to dry out and you don't feel that your pencils are moving enough, take a break, flip your paper over, and add baby oil to the back, and then let that seep in a little bit. You don't want to add it to the front. we've got a lot of color on the front, and if you add baby oil to it, it'll smear the baby oil and the images and all the colors that are just laying on top of each other as nicely as they are, all over the place. So you'll have um, a purple paper basically. So if you do need to add more moisture to your paper, definitely flip it over and do it that way. Okay, so now I'm adding the last bit to the chin. A lot of movement of tone there, but it is very dark around the edges. Now you see where I'm adding the white to the jowls and where it's hitting it the hardest on the face. Try to pay attention to the movement of tone, and that'll help you bring out the roundness in your faces. See where the different tones are in the lips, and just all around, overall. And you'll find that the face is not just one solid color. There's a multitude of colors in a face. All right. And here's where I start to solidify the bottom of his jaw and his neck. Now, with a lot of people of color, in almost every image, you will find an undertone of peach. Peach is one of my favorite colors, but on his face, they didn't have it. So just be mindful of your source image and what it does have, and then accentuate as much as you can. And just keep working it. If it's too dark, you can add white, and you can keep blending it and blending it out. You can add you can use more baby oil, and that'll help blend out more. And as you begin to blend, you'll notice that there's, some of it comes off, so you want to add more colors, like I do right here with the chin. All right, we're almost there, almost done. And in truth, I could have kept going. I could have added more. I could have let it dry a little bit and then come back to it in a day or so just to see how it's looking. And I could add more baby oil to the back and just work it from there. Let it sit for about an hour. But I think it came out pretty good. Just check your tones. Make sure that everything is falling where it should. If it needs to be blended a little bit more, by all means blend. And then I'll be working on the ears. And like I said, the light hit it so hard that you could see highlights on the very edges of some of his ear. And it's not until you get down to the lobe do you see a movement of tone, and it's very subtle. It's more like the mauve color. Now you can also use a lighter tone like mauve to blend some of the stuff together as well. A color to blend other colors. Now if you do find yourself cramping up, just change your hand position and work on a different part of the face. And your hand will relax a little bit, and until you get tired of doing that, and then you move on to another part. You just need to keep sometimes you get stiff. So that's one of the ways to break that up. And take a break. You may see things that you may have missed, or you get a better perspective. Okay, now I'm adding the very, very, very fine hairs that he's got all along his head. And I'm using like a W of movement. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to focus on where are the shadows, where are his highlights. I put those in first. And now I'm just blending more and more. Where it needs to be red or reddish, I added more of that. And it does get a little tedious, but it's worth it. So go ahead and add your little tick marks, and you'll make a very, very, very subtle fade. I started cramping up, so I started moving to different sides of his head. And you'll be able to see, after looking at him for 4 hours, where the darker parts on his head are. And you'll see that I'll smudge those in because you really don't see any detail. Very tiny tick marks. Okay, we're coming up towards the end. And at this point you want to just take a look at anything that you may have missed, anything that you think may need a little bit more tones to it, to get as close to your source image as possible, if that's what you want to do. I used my source image kind of just to get the skin tones and to get the impression of what he looks like. And I thought he was kind of striking, so I've added all those. The more that you put into it, the more fine-tuning that you add to it, the better. I added some blue in the hair, so it'll be a little different parts would be darker. And if you start to get frustrated, just walk away from it for a while, and then come back with some fresh eyes. And you may see things like, oh, this needs to be darker, or this needs to be lighter, or oh, I should add a little bit more highlight to this. Now you will be going and dipping into your highlights, because not every highlight is pure white, especially when you're dealing with skin. And I'm just going back and forth over my source image, looking at it, and just checking to see what needs to be darkened, what needs to be lightened. And that's a little bit more of the same. If I need to darken up some more areas. Oh, and also a tip, when you do a portrait, don't just do a head. Do like the neck, shoulders. You don't want just a head floating in space. It's kind of weird looking. Alrighty, at this point I'd like to thank you for watching and your patience, and I hope that the next images that you come up with will give you some more insights to how to draw a person with darker skin tones. It's worth it. The colors, the movement of tones are absolutely striking. So by all means, get some practice in, and I will see you in the next video. Like and subscribe, and offer some suggestions, and just let me know what you'd like to see next. Thank you again for watching. Have a great one.